Sarah stood at the edge of the clearing, her breath catching as the old chapel came into view. Surrounded by a grove of ancient oaks, the chapel seemed to rise organically from the earth, its stone walls entwined with ivy and moss. She glanced at Mark, who was smiling in that boyish way that always made her heart flutter. "It's perfect," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. Mark squeezed her hand. "It really is. This place has a certain magic to it." They walked closer, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The chapel's wooden door, heavy and dark with age, creaked open as if inviting them in. Inside, the air was cool and slightly musty, carrying the scent of old wood and stone. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the floor. Sarah could almost see their wedding here. The rows of seats filled with friends and family, the aisle decorated with wildflowers, the two of them standing at the altar, promising their lives to each other. It felt right, as if this place had been waiting for them. As they explored, an elderly man appeared in the doorway, startling them both. His face was lined with age, his eyes sharp and observant. He introduced himself as Mr. Thorne, the chapel's caretaker. "Lovely place, isn't it?" he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Not many choose to hold their weddings here anymore." Sarah smiled politely. "It's beautiful. Why wouldn't people want to get married here?" Mr. Thorne's expression darkened. "Old stories, superstitions. You know how small towns are." Mark laughed. "We're not scared of a few ghost stories. This place is perfect for us." Mr. Thorne nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on them. "Just remember, some stories have a grain of truth. Be respectful of the chapel's history." After he left, Sarah felt a slight chill, but she shook it off. This was their dream venue, and nothing would spoil that. They spent the afternoon discussing plans, the excitement growing with each idea. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the chapel, they reluctantly made their way back to the car. Sarah paused at the door, looking back at the chapel one last time. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the shadows near the altar, but when she blinked, it was gone. "Coming!" Mark called, already a few steps ahead. Sarah shook her head and hurried to catch up. She told herself it was just her imagination, a trick of the light. But as they drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something in the chapel was watching them, waiting. Back at their cozy apartment, Sarah and Mark couldn't stop talking about the chapel. Every detail of their dream wedding seemed to come alive as they discussed decorations, seating arrangements, and the ceremony itself. Yet, as night fell and the excitement of the day began to wane, an uneasy feeling settled over Sarah. They went to bed late, their minds still buzzing with plans. Sarah tossed and turned, unable to find a comfortable position. The darkness of the room seemed thicker than usual, pressing down on her. She listened to Mark's steady breathing beside her, trying to let it lull her to sleep. But as the hours dragged on, she felt a presence, something unseen but undeniably there. A faint whisper, just at the edge of hearing, brushed against her consciousness. She sat up, straining to listen. The room was still. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She shook her head, convinced she was just imagining things. The next day, as they continued their wedding planning, Sarah pushed the incident from her mind. But the whispers returned the following night and the night after that. Each time they seemed to grow louder, more insistent. Words she couldn't quite make out, murmured urgently in the darkness. She didn't mention it to Mark at first, not wanting to worry him or seem silly. But after a week of sleepless nights, the stress began to show. Dark circles formed under her eyes, and she found herself snapping at Mark over trivial matters. "Sarah, what's going on?" Mark asked one morning, his voice filled with concern. "You've been on edge all week." She hesitated, then decided to tell him everything. "I've been hearing whispers at night. I know it sounds crazy, but it feels so real. Like someone is trying to tell me something." Mark frowned, wrapping his arms around her. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? Maybe it's just stress. The wedding planning is a lot to handle." Sarah nodded, but deep down, she wasn't convinced it was just stress. The whispers felt too real, too persistent. And there was something else she hadn't told him, something she had seen. The shadowy figure started appearing shortly after the whispers began, always in the corners of her vision, just out of clear sight. She would catch a glimpse of them moving in the hallway or standing at the foot of the bed, only to vanish when she turned her head. The fear gnawed at her, making it hard to think about anything else. That night, she decided to confront whatever was happening. She lay awake, waiting for the whispers. When they came, she sat up and spoke into the darkness. "Who's there? What do you want?" For a moment, the whispers ceased, and a deep silence filled the room. Then, a single, clear word reached her ears. "Leave." Her heart pounded, but she stayed where she was. "Why? What's wrong with the chapel?" The response was immediate, the whispers swirling around her, overlapping and frantic. "Danger. Death. Leave." Sarah's skin prickled with fear, but she was determined to get answers. "What happened there?" The whispers grew louder, more chaotic. She could almost make out individual voices, male and female, young and old. They spoke of pain, betrayal, bloodshed. The words painted a picture of horror that made Sarah's blood run cold. Mark stirred beside her, waking up. "Sarah, what are you doing?" She turned to him, her face pale. "Mark, the whispers. They're warning us. Something terrible happened at the chapel. We need to find out what." Mark rubbed his eyes, still half asleep. Okay. We'll look into it tomorrow. But for now, let's try to get some rest." Sarah nodded, lying back down. The whispers had faded, but the fear remained. She knew that whatever secrets the chapel held, they were closer to the surface than she had ever imagined, and she was determined to uncover them, no matter what it took. The following morning, Sarah and Mark were both on edge. The lingering effects of the previous night's encounter hung over them like a dark cloud. Determined to understand what was happening, Sarah delved into researching the chapel's history, while Mark tried to focus on his work, distracted by the tension at home. At first, the day passed uneventfully, but as evening approached, the air seemed to thicken with an oppressive weight. Objects began to move on their own. At first it was subtle, a book falling off a shelf, a picture frame tilting to one side. Sarah and Mark exchanged nervous glances but said nothing, each hoping it was a coincidence. By nightfall, the activity escalated. The temperature in the apartment dropped sharply, their breath visible in the icy air. Lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling every corner of their home. Sarah stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she washed the dishes. The whispers seemed to converge around her, making it impossible to concentrate. Suddenly, the faucet turned off by itself, and the room was plunged into silence. She backed away, her heart racing, only to see the figure of a woman, pale and translucent, standing in the doorway. "Mark!" Sarah screamed, stumbling backward. Mark rushed in, skidding to a halt as he saw the ghostly figure. The woman's eyes were hollow, her mouth moving soundlessly as if trying to communicate. She raised a hand, pointing accusingly at Sarah, then vanished as quickly as she had appeared. "What was that?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "But we can't ignore this anymore." They decided to visit the local library, hoping to uncover more about the chapel's past. The librarian, a kind old woman named Mrs. Granger, listened intently as they described their experiences. "The old chapel," she said, her expression somber. "It has a dark history. There was a massacre there centuries ago. Many innocent lives were lost, and it said their spirits never found peace." Sarah's heart sank. "What happened?" Mrs. Granger led them to the historical archives, where she pulled out a dusty old book. It was a place of refuge during a violent conflict. People from the village sought shelter there, but they were betrayed by one of their own. The chapel was set on fire, trapping everyone inside. Their screams could be heard for miles, but no one could save them. Mark's face paled. "That's horrifying." Mrs. Granger nodded. "Over the years, there have been many reports of hauntings. Some say the spirits are trying to warn the living. Others believe they seek vengeance." Armed with this grim knowledge, Sarah and Mark returned home. The atmosphere in the apartment was tense, the weight of the chapel's history pressing down on them. That night, the hauntings grew even more intense. The shadows seemed to come alive, twisting into grotesque shapes. The whispers became screams, echoing through the rooms. In the middle of the night, Mark woke to find Sarah standing by the window, her eyes wide and unseeing. She was whispering, her voice mingling with the ghostly chorus. He shook her gently, trying to snap her out of the trance. "Sarah, wake up!" She blinked, her eyes focusing on him. "Mark, they're so angry. They want justice for what happened to them." "We need to leave," Mark said urgently. "This is too dangerous." Sarah shook her head. "We can't run from this. We need to find a way to help them, to put their spirits to rest." Despite their fear, they resolved to confront the haunting head-on. They spent the next few days researching rituals and methods to communicate with the dead, hoping to find a way to appease the spirits. But as they delved deeper into the occult, the hauntings became more personal, targeting their deepest fears and insecurities. Sarah began to see the ghostly woman everywhere, her accusing finger always pointing, her silent words a constant reminder of the chapel's bloody past. Mark felt a cold hand grip his heart whenever he entered the bedroom, a shadowy figure looming over him as he slept. The couple knew they were running out of time. The spirit's wrath was growing, and if they didn't find a way to end the curse soon, they might become the next victims of the chapel's dark legacy. The next day, with a new resolve to understand the full extent of the chapel's tragic history, Sarah and Mark returned to the library. Mrs. Granger had mentioned that the chapel's history was well documented, and they hoped to find detailed accounts of the massacre and any clues on how to appease the spirits. As they pored over old newspapers, letters, and journals, the chilling tale of the massacre came to life. The chapel, once a sanctuary for villagers during times of war, had become a tomb. Sarah shuddered as she read a first-hand account written by a survivor who had narrowly escaped the flames. They came under the cover of night, their faces twisted with rage and fear. We had taken refuge in the chapel, believing its walls would protect us. But betrayal is a wicked thing, and one of our own turned against us, sealing the doors and setting the fire. The screams. Oh, the screams still haunt my dreams. We were trapped, no way out, the fire consuming all. I can still see their faces, twisted in agony, pleading for help that would never come. Sarah put the journal down, her hands shaking. Mark, this is worse than I imagined. The betrayal, the sheer terror. No wonder their spirits are restless. Mark, reading another account, nodded grimly. It says here that the traitor was never identified. The villagers suspected several people, but the truth was lost in the chaos. Maybe that's why the spirits can't find peace. They need the truth to be revealed. Determined to uncover more, they sought out Mr. Thorne, the chapel's caretaker. He was reluctant to speak at first, but when Sarah and Mark explained their experiences, he softened. The chapel holds many secrets, Mr. Thorne said, leading them to a back room filled with old documents and artifacts. My family has been caretakers for generations. We've always known about the hauntings, but most folks don't take the story seriously. Sarah's eyes scanned the room, landing on an old, tattered map of the chapel grounds. "What's this?" she asked, pointing to a series of markings on the map. Mr. Thorne's eyes followed her gaze. "Those are the locations where people have reported seeing apparitions. My father used to say that the spirits are bound to those spots, reliving their final moments." Mark traced a finger over the map. "If we could identify the traitor, maybe we could help the spirits find peace." Mr. Thorne nodded. "There are a few letters and diaries from the time of the massacre that might hold clues. You're welcome to look through them." They spent hours combing through the old documents, piecing together fragments of the past. A recurring name caught Sarah's attention: Thomas, a villager who had mysteriously disappeared shortly after the massacre. "Thomas was close to the village leaders," she read aloud. "He had access to the chapel and was seen near the chapel the night of the fire, but there's no record of him after that night." Mark leaned over her shoulder. "If Thomas was the traitor, his disappearance makes sense. But where did he go?" Their search led them to a faded letter written by a villager named Margaret, who had been a child during the massacre. The letter, addressed to her grandchildren, detailed her suspicions about Thomas and his possible involvement with enemy forces. "I saw Thomas that night, slipping away into the woods. He looked frightened, guilty. I never told anyone, afraid of what might happen to my family. But now, as I near the end of my days, I feel it's important to tell the truth. Maybe in doing so, I can help those poor souls find peace." Sarah's heart raced. "This is it, Mark. This is the key. If we can prove Thomas was the traitor, we might be able to appease the spirits." Armed with this new information, they returned to the chapel. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the grounds. As they approached the old building, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The air was thick with anticipation, the spirits sensing their presence. Inside, the chapel was eerily quiet. They laid out the documents, hoping the spirits would understand their intentions. Sarah held the letter aloft, her voice trembling as she read Margaret's confession. "We know what happened," she said, her voice echoing in the stillness. "Thomas was the traitor. He betrayed you. We're here to help you find peace." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the temperature dropped sharply, and the air filled with a low, mournful wail. Ghostly figures began to materialize, their faces etched with pain and sorrow. They hovered around Sarah and Mark, their eyes pleading. Suddenly, the figure of the woman Sarah had seen before stepped forward. Her expression was no longer accusatory, but filled with a profound sadness. She reached out, her translucent fingers brushing Sarah's hand. A soft whisper filled the air, clear and unmistakable. "Thank you." The figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into the air. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a sense of calm. Sarah and Mark stood in the now quiet chapel, the weight of the past finally lifting. As they left the chapel that night, they felt a sense of accomplishment. They had unearthed the dark history and brought some measure of peace to the restless spirits. But the journey was far from over. The whispers and shadows might have retreated, but the chapel's dark legacy was still very much alive, and they knew they would need to stay vigilant. The next few days passed in an uneasy calm. Sarah and Mark tried to focus on their wedding plans, hoping the worst was behind them. Yet, an undercurrent of tension remained, as if the air itself was holding its breath. One evening, as they were going over the guest list, Mark decided to take a break and step outside. The night was cool and crisp, the sky clear and dotted with stars. He walked to the edge of their yard, breathing in the fresh air, trying to shake off the lingering unease. As he stood there, he heard a soft rustling behind him. He turned, expecting to see a stray animal or the wind stirring the leaves, but the yard was empty. Shaking his head, he started to walk back to the house when a figure materialized in front of him. It was a man, his form hazy and translucent, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. His eyes were hollow, his expression one of deep sorrow. Mark froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who are you?" Mark managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. The ghostly figure seemed to struggle to speak, his voice raspy and weak. "My name is Samuel. I was one of the villagers trapped in the chapel." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you want from us?" Samuel's eyes bore into Mark's. "You must leave the chapel. It is cursed. The spirits cannot rest as long as it stands." Mark took a step back, fear gripping him. "But we've already started planning our wedding there. We're trying to help the spirits find peace." Samuel shook his head slowly. "The chapel's curse runs deeper than you know, more than just the massacre. It's a place of darkness, a magnet for evil. You must not marry there." Before Mark could respond, Samuel's form began to waver and fade. "Leave, before it's too late," he whispered. And then he was gone. Mark stood there, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. The warning was clear, but they had invested so much into the chapel. Could they really abandon their plans now? He hurried back inside, finding Sarah still poring over the guest list. "Sarah, we need to talk." She looked up, concern etched on her face. "What is it?" Mark explained what had happened, describing his encounter with Samuel and the warning he had received. Sarah listened, her expression growing more troubled with each word. "Mark, this is serious. If the spirits are telling us to leave, maybe we should consider it." Mark ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "I know, but we've put so much into this already. And we're trying to help them, aren't we? Maybe there's another way." Sarah nodded slowly. "We need to find out more. If the chapel is truly cursed, we need to understand why. Maybe there's something we've missed." The next day, they returned to the library, seeking out Mrs. Granger once more. She greeted them with a knowing look, as if she had been expecting their return. "We need more information," Sarah said. "Something beyond the massacre. Samuel, one of the spirits, warned us about a deeper curse." Mrs. Granger's face grew serious. "There have always been rumors about the land the chapel is built on. Some say it was a site of dark rituals long before the chapel was constructed. There are stories of an ancient evil that was never fully banished." She led them to a dusty corner of the library where old, crumbling books lined the shelves. "These might help. They contain some of the oldest records and legends about the area." Sarah and Mark spent hours going through the books, finding tales of witchcraft, sacrifices, and dark rituals performed in the woods where the chapel now stood. One account spoke of a powerful artifact, a black stone said to be a conduit for malevolent forces. It was rumored to be buried beneath the chapel, drawing in darkness and corrupting the land. If this stone is real, it could explain why the spirits are so restless, Mark said. Maybe we need to find it and destroy it. Sarah agreed, but we'll need help. This isn't something we can handle on our own. They decided to reach out to a paranormal expert, someone who could guide them in dealing with the dark forces at play. As they made arrangements to meet with the expert, the sense of urgency grew. They knew time was running out, and the chapel's curse was closing in on them. That night, as they prepared for bed, the shadows in their room seemed to deepen, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. Sarah and Mark held each other close, their determination steeling them against the growing darkness. They had a plan, and they were ready to confront whatever malevolent force lay beneath the chapel. But as they drifted off to sleep, a new, chilling realization settled over them. The spirits might not be the only ones watching them. Something darker, more sinister, was aware of their intentions, and it would do anything to protect its secrets. The following days were a blur of frantic activity. Sarah and Mark contacted Dr. Evelyn Harper, a renowned paranormal expert, and arranged for her to meet them at the chapel. Dr. Harper had spent decades studying haunted sites and uncovering the secrets of cursed places, and they hoped she could help them unravel the mystery of the Black Stone and the chapel's dark past. As they awaited her arrival, the atmosphere in their apartment grew increasingly oppressive. The once subtle hauntings now became aggressive and relentless. Cold drafts that had been mere nuisances turned into icy blasts that left frost on the windows. Objects flew across the room with violent force, and the whispers transformed into anguished screams that echoed through the night. Sarah and Mark found themselves arguing more frequently, their patience frayed by the constant stress and lack of sleep. The dark circles under Sarah's eyes deepened, and Mark's normally calm demeanor was replaced by a short temper. The malevolent presence seemed to be feeding off their fear and discord, driving a wedge between them. One evening, as Sarah was preparing dinner, she felt a cold hand grip her shoulder. She spun around, knife in hand, to find nothing there. But the pressure remained, icy fingers digging into her skin. She screamed, dropping the knife, and Mark came running into the kitchen. "What happened?" he asked, eyes wide with panic. Sarah rubbed her shoulder, tears streaming down her face. "Something grabbed me. I felt it, Mark. It was so real." Mark's face hardened. "This has to stop. We can't live like this anymore." They decided to spend the night in a hotel, hoping to escape the relentless hauntings, if only for a few hours. But even in the hotel room, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sarah woke in the middle of the night to find Mark standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. "Mark, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. He turned to her, his eyes vacant. "I keep seeing them, Sarah. The spirits. They're everywhere." Sarah rushed to his side, shaking him gently. "Mark, you need to rest. Come back to bed." He allowed her to lead him back, but sleep did not come easily. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and move, forming sinister shapes that loomed over them. Sarah felt as if the darkness was closing in, suffocating her. The next morning, they met Dr. Harper at the chapel. She was a tall, imposing woman with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through them. She listened intently as they recounted their experiences, nodding thoughtfully. "This is a powerful curse," Dr. Harper said. "If the Black Stone is indeed the source, We need to locate and destroy it. But be warned, such artifacts are often protected by malevolent forces." They followed her into the chapel, the air growing colder with each step. Dr. Harper carried a small bag filled with tools and charms, which she began to lay out methodically. She lit candles and incense, the fragrant smoke curling into the air, mingling with the faint scent of decay. As Dr. Harper began her ritual, chanting in a language neither Sarah nor Mark recognized, the chapel seemed to come alive. The walls vibrated and a low, mournful wail filled the air. Ghostly figures appeared, their faces twisted in agony. The temperature plummeted, and a howling wind whipped through the chapel, extinguishing the candles. Dr. Harper's voice rose above the cacophony, her chants growing louder and more forceful. She motioned for Sarah and Mark to join her, handing them each a small charm for protection. "Stay close and do exactly as I say," she instructed. They followed her to the altar where she knelt and began to dig. The ground was hard and unyielding, but Dr. Harper's determination never wavered. After what felt like an eternity, her shovel struck something solid. She cleared away the dirt to reveal a smooth, black stone, its surface glistening with an otherworldly sheen. "This is it," Dr. Harper said, her voice tense. "The source of the curse." As she prepared to destroy the stone, the spirits around them grew more agitated. The wailing intensified, and the air crackled with energy. A dark figure materialized behind Dr. Harper, its eyes burning with malevolence. Sarah screamed a warning, but it was too late. The figure lunged at Dr. Harper, knocking her to the ground. Mark rushed to help, but was thrown back by an invisible force. Sarah watched in horror as the dark figure loomed over Dr. Harper, its hand reaching for the black stone. With a final desperate chant, Dr. Harper raised her hand and struck the stone with a small hammer. The chapel erupted in a blinding light, the dark figure disintegrating into a cloud of ash. The wailing ceased, and the spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the air. Sarah and Mark helped Dr. Harper to her feet. She was shaken but unhurt. "The stone is destroyed," she said, her voice weary. "The curse should be lifted, but the chapel's dark history will linger. Be cautious." They thanked her, their relief palpable. As they left the chapel, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a sense of calm. But the experience had taken its toll. Sarah and Mark knew their journey was far from over. The chapel's dark legacy might be diminished, but its echoes would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had confronted their deepest fears and survived. But as they drove away, a new, chilling realization settled over them. The darkness they had faced was only the beginning. The true test of their resolve and their love was yet to come. The sense of relief from destroying the black stone was short-lived. The residual effects of the curse still lingered in subtle, unsettling ways. Sarah and Mark found it hard to return to their normal lives, their minds constantly haunted by what they had experienced. Nightmares plagued their sleep, and the once calm and cozy apartment now felt like a battleground. Desperate for answers, Sarah contacted Mrs. Granger again. They met at the library, hoping to uncover more information about the chapel and its lingering curse. Mrs. Granger greeted them with a concerned expression, having heard about their recent ordeal. "I've been doing some research of my own," Mrs. Granger said, leading them to a secluded corner of the library. "There's something more to the chapel's history that we've overlooked." She pulled out an ancient leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. "This is a journal from one of the first settlers of the area. It mentions a powerful artifact hidden beneath the chapel, but it also talks about a ritual to put the spirits to rest permanently." Sarah and Mark leaned in, their eyes scanning the faded text. The journal detailed a series of steps to perform the ritual, each one more complex and dangerous than the last. It required specific items and a deep understanding of ancient rites. "If we can gather these items and perform the ritual," Mrs. Granger said, "we might be able to end the hauntings for good. But it won't be easy." Determined to end the curse once and for all, Sarah and Mark set out to gather the necessary items. Their first stop was a local antique shop, rumored to have rare and mystical artifacts. The shop was dark and cluttered, filled with strange objects that seemed to hum with latent energy. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with piercing eyes, greeted them with a knowing smile. "I've been expecting you," he said, his voice gravelly. "The spirits of the chapel have sent many to my door." He led them to a back room where he produced a small, ornate box. Inside were several ancient items: a silver dagger, a vial of holy water, a bundle of dried herbs, and a worn piece of parchment covered in runes. "These are what you need," the shopkeeper said, "but be warned, the spirits will not let you complete the ritual easily. They are bound to the chapel by powerful forces." Sarah and Mark thanked him, paying a hefty sum for the items, and left the shop feeling a mix of hope and dread. That night, they studied the parchment, deciphering the runes and preparing for the ritual. The instructions were clear. They had to perform the ritual at midnight, under a full moon, and each step had to be executed perfectly. As the night of the ritual approached, the hauntings intensified. The spirits, sensing their intentions, grew more aggressive. Objects in the apartment were hurled across rooms, the walls dripped with blood-like substances, and the screams of the damned filled the air. Sarah and Mark's relationship, already strained, was pushed to the breaking point. One evening, as Sarah sat alone in the living room, trying to focus on the ritual preparations, she heard a faint cry for help. She followed the sound to the bedroom, where she found Mark curled up on the floor, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. "Mark, what happened?" she asked, rushing to his side. He looked up at her, his voice barely a whisper. "I saw them, Sarah. The spirits. They're suffering so much. They're trapped in endless torment. We have to help them." Sarah hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "We will, Mark. We'll end this nightmare. I promise." With renewed determination, they prepared for the ritual. On the night of the full moon, they drove to the chapel, their car packed with the necessary items. The air was thick with anticipation, the moon casting an eerie glow over the old building. They entered the chapel, the temperature dropping instantly. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the shadows danced with malevolent intent. Sarah and Mark set up the ritual space, arranging the items according to the parchment's instructions. As midnight approached, they began the ritual. Sarah recited the ancient incantations, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Mark lit the herbs and sprinkled the holy water, the air filling with the scent of smoke and sanctity. The spirits reacted violently, their forms swirling around them, trying to disrupt the ritual. But Sarah and Mark held firm, their voices rising above the chaos. The final step required them to use the silver dagger to make a small cut on their palms, letting their blood mix with the herbs and holy water. As their blood dripped onto the altar, a blinding light filled the chapel. The spirits screamed, their forms twisting and contorting as the ritual took hold. The ground beneath them shook, and a deep rumbling sound echoed through the building. For a moment, it felt as if the world itself was tearing apart. Then, with a final ear-piercing wail, the spirits were gone. The chapel fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting, replaced by an almost tangible sense of peace. Sarah and Mark collapsed to the ground, exhausted but relieved. They had done it. The spirits were at rest, and the curse was finally lifted. As they left the chapel, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon, they knew they had not only freed the spirits, but also themselves. The darkness that had haunted them was gone, and they could finally look forward to a future without fear. The morning after the ritual, Sarah and Mark awoke feeling a sense of calm they hadn't experienced in months. The air in their apartment was no longer heavy with dread, and the constant feeling of being watched had vanished. But the journey wasn't over. They needed to return to the chapel one last time to ensure that the spirits had truly found peace. Armed with the knowledge from Mrs. Granger and the items from the antique shop, they drove to the chapel, the morning sun casting long shadows over the old structure. The chapel now looked serene, its walls no longer emanating the oppressive aura that had once surrounded it. As they approached, Sarah felt a sense of trepidation. "Are you ready for this?" she asked Mark, squeezing his hand. Mark nodded, his jaw set with determination. "We need to be sure." Inside the chapel, the atmosphere was markedly different. The air was still cool, but it lacked the biting chill that had once greeted them. The shadows were just shadows now, not malevolent entities waiting to strike. They set up for the final part of the ritual, which required them to consecrate the ground and make a final plea for peace. Dr. Harper had provided them with a detailed guide for this part of the ritual. It involved drawing a protective circle, lighting candles at its points, and chanting a prayer for rest. They worked quickly, their movements synchronized and purposeful. As Sarah lit the last candle, the air around them began to shimmer. The protective circle glowed softly, casting a warm light over the chapel. She took a deep breath and began to chant, her voice clear and steady. "Spirits of this place, we call upon you. We ask for your forgiveness and seek to grant you peace. The wrongs of the past have been revealed. Rest now, and let your souls be free." Mark joined in, their voices blending in a harmonious plea. The ground within the circle began to pulse with a gentle light, and a soft hum filled the air. It was as if the chapel itself was responding, acknowledging their efforts. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the ghostly figure of the woman Sarah had seen before materialized in front of them. Her face, once twisted in agony, now bore a look of profound sadness. "Thank you," the woman whispered, her voice echoing through the chapel. "We have waited so long for this. The pain, the fear, it has held us here. But now, we can move on." More spirits began to appear, their forms shimmering in the candlelight. Men, women, and children, all the victims of the chapel's dark past, gathered within the circle. They no longer looked tormented. Instead, they seemed relieved, their features softened by a sense of release. The woman reached out, her translucent hand brushing against Sarah's cheek. "You have given us what we needed. We can finally find peace." With that, the spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the light. The chapel grew warmer, the oppressive weight lifting completely. The protective circle's glow dimmed and then vanished, leaving behind a tranquil silence. Sarah and Mark stood in the now empty chapel, the enormity of what they had done sinking in. They had freed the spirits, lifted the curse, and finally put the chapel's dark history to rest. "We did it," Mark said, his voice filled with awe and relief. Sarah nodded, tears of happiness streaming down her face. "We really did." As they left the chapel hand in hand, they felt a profound sense of closure. The ordeal had tested them in ways they never imagined, but it had also strengthened their bond and their resolve. They knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they could face them together. Back at their apartment, they found the atmosphere completely transformed. The dark shadows were gone, replaced by a lightness that filled every corner. They spent the evening in quiet reflection, grateful for the peace they had found. That night, they slept deeply and dreamlessly for the first time in months. The past no longer haunted them, and the future stretched out before them, bright and full of promise. But as they slept, a soft whisper echoed through the apartment, a final farewell from the spirits they had freed. "Thank you." Sarah and Mark had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, their love and courage shining brighter than ever. The chapel's curse was broken, its spirits at rest, and the couple could finally move forward, free from the shadows of the past. Sarah and Mark woke the next morning feeling lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from their shoulders. They busied themselves with wedding plans, confident that the worst was behind them. However, their relief was short-lived. As the days passed, strange occurrences began anew, more intense and terrifying than before. One evening, while they were discussing seating arrangements, the lights in the apartment flickered and went out. A chill settled over the room, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. Objects began to move on their own, violently clattering to the floor. Sarah clutched Mark's arm. "I thought it was over. We freed them. What's happening?" Mark's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Something else is at play. Maybe we missed something." Their thoughts raced back to the chapel's dark history, and the possibility that the ancient evil connected to the Black Stone hadn't been entirely vanquished. They realized they needed to return to the chapel one last time to confront whatever lingering darkness remained. That night, they armed themselves with the remaining protective items from Dr. Harper, feeling an impending sense of dread as they approached the chapel. The building loomed in the darkness, its stone walls cold and unwelcoming. Inside, the air was thick with malevolence. The peaceful atmosphere from their last visit was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of danger. Shadows danced across the walls, and the whispers grew into a deafening roar. As they made their way to the altar, the ground began to tremble, and a dark, swirling vortex appeared before them. From within the vortex, a figure emerged, tall, cloaked in shadows, with eyes that burned like hot coals. "This place is mine," the figure hissed, its voice echoing with ancient power. "You cannot banish me so easily." Sarah and Mark stood their ground, holding tightly to each other and the protective charms. "We freed the spirits you tormented," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her fear. "You have no power here anymore." The figure laughed, a chilling sound that reverberated through the chapel. "Foolish mortals. The spirits may be gone, but the darkness that binds this place remains. And now, it hungers for you." With a wave of its hand, the figure summoned shadowy tendrils that lashed out at them. Sarah and Mark dodged and stumbled, their protective charms glowing faintly in the oppressive darkness. "Remember the ritual," Mark shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand. "We need to finish what we started." Together, they began to chant the incantations Dr. Harper had taught them, their voices rising above the chaos. The charms in their hands glowed brighter, forming a protective barrier around them. The dark figure writhed and howled, its form distorting and flickering. The ground beneath them shook violently, and cracks began to appear in the chapel's stone floor. Sarah and Mark continued their chant, pouring all their will and strength into the ritual. The protective barrier expanded, pushing back the dark tendrils and weakening the figure's hold on the chapel. "By the light of truth and the power of love, we banish you," they cried in unison, their voices echoing with a power that seemed to come from deep within their souls. The dark figure shrieked, its form dissolving into the swirling vortex. The tendrils disintegrated, and the vortex began to collapse in on itself, taking the last remnants of the ancient evil with it. With a final deafening roar, the vortex imploded, leaving the chapel eerily silent. Sarah and Mark collapsed to the ground, exhausted but victorious. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a sense of profound peace. The chapel's walls, once cold and foreboding, now seemed warm and inviting. They rose to their feet, looking around the chapel one last time. The darkness was gone, and the spirits were truly at rest. They had faced their deepest fears and emerged stronger, their love and determination overcoming the ancient curse that had plagued the chapel for centuries. As they walked out into the first light of dawn, Sarah turned to Mark, her eyes shining with tears of relief and happiness. "We did it. It's finally over." Mark smiled, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Yes, it's over. We can move forward now without fear." The couple left the chapel hand in hand, the sun rising behind them, casting a golden glow over the landscape. The horrors of the past were behind them, and a bright future awaited. Their wedding would be a celebration of not only their love, but their triumph over the darkness that had once threatened to consume them. The cursed chapel, once a place of fear and torment, had been transformed into a symbol of hope and resilience. Sarah and Mark knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they could face them together, their bond unbreakable and their love enduring. The final stand against the darkness had not only freed the spirits, but it also solidified their commitment to each other, forever entwining their souls in the light of their shared victory.